My name is Rachel Bennett, and the day I walked into that attorney's office in downtown Portland, I believed I was going to honor my parents' final wishes. Instead, I discovered that my brother David had rewritten their entire legacy, erasing me from the family I helped hold together. The rain outside matched the chill that crept through my bones as Thomas Whitmore slid a single document across his mahogany desk. According to the will in front of me, I was worth nothing. Every asset, every memory, every piece of our parents' life had been signed over to David. But what cut deepest wasn't the money. It was the realization that while I had been holding my mother's hand through her final breath, my brother had been forging her signature on documents that would steal everything she wanted me to have. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The law office smelled of old leather and lemon polish, the kind of place where serious conversations happen behind closed doors. Thomas Whitmore's office sat on the 7th floor of a building that overlooked the Willamette River, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the gray October sky pressing down on the city like a weight. Rain streaked the glass in crooked lines, distorting the view of the bridges and the water below. I sat in one of 2 chairs facing his desk, my hands folded in my lap, still wearing my EMT uniform because I had come straight from a 12-hour shift. The fabric smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion. David arrived 20 minutes late, which was typical. He pushed through the door with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He didn't look at me. He barely acknowledged my presence as he settled into the chair beside mine, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate slowness. The scent of expensive cologne filled the space between us, sharp and overwhelming. Thomas cleared his throat and opened a folder on his desk. He was an older man, mid-60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light when he moved. His expression was carefully neutral, the kind of face trained to deliver bad news without flinching. He began reading the will aloud, his voice steady and professional. The Selwood house, the one where we grew up, where our mother had planted roses every spring and our father had built a workshop in the garage, went to David. The savings accounts, modest but carefully maintained over decades of work, went to David. The life insurance policies, the retirement funds, the small investment portfolio our father had nurtured through every market downturn, all of it went to David. My name appeared only once, in a line that felt like a slap. Rachel Bennett is to receive personal items of sentimental value only, as determined by the executor. The executor, of course, was David. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't interrupt. I didn't cry. I let Thomas finish reading every word, every clause, every cold legal phrase that reduced my parents' love to a single dismissive sentence. When he finally closed the folder and looked up, his eyes moved between us, waiting for a reaction. David leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He looked like someone who had just won a hand of poker he had been bluffing on all night. I found my voice, though it came out quieter than I intended. This doesn't make sense. My mother told me she wanted me to have the house. She said it a dozen times. David's smile widened just a fraction. People say a lot of things when they're sick, Rachel. Mom wasn't in her right mind at the end. You know that. His tone was smooth, practiced, like he had rehearsed this conversation in front of a mirror. I turned to Thomas, searching his face for some indication that he saw what I saw, that this was wrong. Is this will contested? Can I request a review? Thomas shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. You can contest it, of course, but the document is signed, witnessed, and notarized. It was filed 3 months before your mother's passing. Unless you have evidence of undue influence or fraud, the court is unlikely to overturn it. 3 months before she died. I thought back to that time, trying to remember anything unusual. My mother had been in Pine Ridge memory care for nearly a year by then, her dementia progressing in unpredictable waves. Some days she knew me. Other days she called me by her sister's name. I had visited her every other day, sometimes more, sitting beside her bed and reading aloud from the books she used to love. David had visited too, but his trips were shorter, more sporadic. He always seemed to arrive when I wasn't there, slipping in during the narrow windows between my shifts at the hospital. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. I need copies of everything. The will, the witnesses, the notary signatures. All of it. Thomas nodded and reached for a file box behind his desk. I can provide that. It's your right. David stood as well, straightening his jacket. Don't drag this out, Rachel. Mom and Dad made their decision. You're only going to embarrass yourself. I met his eyes for the first time since he walked in. His gaze was cold, detached, like he was looking at a stranger. I didn't respond. I took the folder Thomas handed me, tucked it under my arm, and walked out of that office without another word. The rain hit me the moment I stepped outside, soaking through my uniform in seconds. I didn't care. I stood on the sidewalk, letting the cold water run down my face, and opened the folder. The will was on top, printed on heavy cream-colored paper. My mother's signature sat at the bottom, shaky and uneven. I stared at it, tracing the loops and lines with my eyes. Something about it felt wrong. My mother's handwriting had always been neat, even in her later years. This signature looked forced, the letters too large, the spacing inconsistent. I flipped to the next page and found the notary seal. Amanda Price. The name meant nothing to me. I pulled out my phone, water dripping onto the screen, and called Jordan Cruz. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. Rachel, hey, you okay? No, I said, my voice shaking now that I was alone. I need your help. Jordan had been my partner in the ambulance for 5 years before I transferred to a different district. He was the kind of person who asked the right questions and never made you feel weak for needing support. He also had a knack for problem solving that bordered on obsessive. Tell me where you are, he said. I'll be there in 10. True to his word, Jordan pulled up in his beat-up pickup truck exactly 9 minutes later. I climbed into the passenger seat, dripping rainwater onto his floor mats. He handed me a towel without a word and waited while I dried my face and hands. Then, he looked at me, his dark eyes steady. What happened? I told him everything. The will, the dismissive clause, David's smug expression, the signature that didn't look right. Jordan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain. Then he said, we need to see the original documents. Not copies. Originals. I nodded, already thinking the same thing. And I need to talk to someone who knew my parents when they were still lucid. Someone who can tell me if this will reflect what they actually wanted. Jordan started the engine, the heater blowing lukewarm air into the cab. I know a guy, he said. Document examiner. Works with the police sometimes. If there's something off about that signature, he'll find it. I leaned back against the seat, exhaustion settling into my bones. The rain drummed against the roof of the truck, a relentless rhythm that felt almost comforting. For the first time since walking out of that law office, I felt something other than shock. I felt the faint stirring of resolve. David thought he had won. He thought I would accept the crumbs he left me and disappear quietly into the background of his new life. But preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He didn't know me as well as he thought. I had spent years walking into burning buildings, pulling people out of wrecked cars, performing CPR on strangers while their families sobbed beside me. I knew how to stay calm under pressure. I knew how to think clearly when everything around me was chaos. And I knew how to fight for what mattered. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Selwood house looked smaller than I remembered, though nothing about its structure had changed. The craftsman-style bungalow sat on a corner lot lined with maple trees, their leaves turning copper and gold in the autumn air. The porch where my father used to sit with his morning coffee still had the same wooden swing, though the paint had faded to a dull gray. I parked across the street, engine idling, and watched the house for a long time. Lights glowed in the front windows, warm and inviting, as if the place hadn't been gutted of everyone who made it a home. Jordan sat beside me in the passenger seat, a camera with a long lens resting on his lap. He had insisted on coming, said I shouldn't do this alone. I was grateful for it, even if I hadn't said so out loud. We had been sitting here for 40 minutes, watching David move through the rooms like he owned the place. Which legally he did. Through the sheer curtains, I could see him in the living room, talking on his phone, gesturing with one hand while he paced. The furniture was still the same, my mother's floral couch, my father's recliner near the fireplace, the bookshelf crammed with novels and photo albums. It looked like a museum of our family, preserved but lifeless. David disappeared from view, and a moment later, a woman appeared. She was tall, blonde, dressed in yoga pants and an oversized sweater. Amanda Price. I recognized her from the notary signature on the will. She moved through the kitchen with easy familiarity, opening cabinets, pouring herself a glass of wine. She wasn't a guest. She was comfortable here, like she had been coming and going for months. Jordan raised the camera and started taking pictures, the shutter clicking softly in the quiet cab of the truck. Document everything, he murmured. Timestamps, faces, behavior. If she's living here, that's worth knowing. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, fingers moving quickly. Amanda Price arrived at the house at 6:43 in the evening. Behaves as though she is a resident. Accesses kitchen and living areas without hesitation. Appears to be in a relationship with David Bennett. Jordan glanced over at my screen and nodded approvingly. You're thinking like an investigator now. Good. Keep that up. I saved the note and leaned back, watching as Amanda settled onto the couch with her wine glass. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling, completely at ease. A few minutes later, David reappeared and sat beside her, draping his arm over her shoulders. They looked like a couple playing house in someone else's life. My stomach turned. This was my parents' home. The place where my mother had baked bread every Sunday, where my father had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, where we had gathered around the dining table for every holiday and birthday. And now it was a backdrop for David's new life, a prop in whatever story he was telling himself. I thought about the will again, the cold language that had reduced my inheritance to sentimental items as determined by the executor. I hadn't been back to the house since the reading. David had changed the locks the same day, claiming it was for security. When I asked if I could come by to collect some of my mother's things, he told me he would let me know when it was convenient. That was 2 weeks ago. I hadn't heard from him since. Jordan lowered the camera and turned to me. You need to get inside that house. Not tonight, not like this. But soon. You need to see what he's done with their belongings, document what's missing, and figure out if there's anything in there that contradicts this will. I nodded slowly. How do I do that without breaking in? He smiled, a faint curve of his mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't break in. You get invited. Or you find another way. Legal way. We'll figure it out. We stayed for another hour, watching the house until the lights in the living room dimmed and Amanda and David moved upstairs. Jordan took a few final photos of David's car in the driveway, a brand new Tesla Model S that gleamed even in the dim streetlight. That's a $70,000 car, Jordan said quietly. Didn't he just buy that? I thought back to the weeks after my mother's funeral. David had shown up in the Tesla, claiming it was a lease for work. But now seeing it parked in front of the house like a trophy, I wondered, how does a real estate developer afford that right now? The market's been rough. Jordan shrugged. Maybe he's doing better than he lets on. Or maybe he came into some money recently. The implication hung in the air between us. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think my brother would be that calculating. But the numbers were starting to form a pattern I couldn't ignore. I pulled out my phone again and made another note. David purchased a new Tesla Model S within weeks of mother's passing. Estimated value $70,000. Timeline suspicious given market conditions and lack of disclosed income sources. Jordan glanced at the note and nodded. Good. Keep tracking everything. Money leaves trails, and people like David get careless when they think they've won. We drove back to Jordan's place in silence, the rain starting up again as we crossed the Hawthorne Bridge. His apartment was above a garage he rented in an industrial area near the Pearl District, a space that was half workshop and half living quarters. The main floor was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and electronics in various states of disassembly. Upstairs was cleaner, a simple studio with a kitchenette and a futon that doubled as a couch. He made coffee while I spread the will documents across his workbench, weighting down the corners with wrenches and tape measures. I stared at my mother's signature again, the loops and angles that felt wrong. Jordan set a mug beside me and leaned over my shoulder. You keep looking at that like it's going to confess. I do, I admitted. Because something about it doesn't fit. My mother's hands were shaky near the end, but her signature stayed consistent. This looks like someone tried to copy it but didn't quite get the rhythm right. Jordan pulled out a magnifying glass from a drawer and held it over the signature. The ink was slightly uneven, pooling in certain spots as if the pen had hesitated. See that? He said, pointing to the letter M in Margaret. That's a stop and start. Someone copying a signature usually pauses to check their work. A real signature flows. I felt a spark of hope flicker in my chest. Can we prove that? Jordan straightened and pulled out his phone. That's where Elena comes in. He scrolled through his contacts and pulled up a name. Dr. Elena Vasquez. Forensic document examiner. She's testified in court about handwriting analysis and forgery. If anyone can tell us whether this signature is legitimate, it's her. He tapped her name and put the phone on speaker. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, clear and professional. Jordan, it's been a while. What do you need? Jordan gave her a quick summary, explaining the will, the suspicious signature, and the timeline. Elena listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Bring me the original document if you can, she said finally. I'll need to examine the paper, the ink, the pressure points. If it's a forgery, I'll find it. But you need to understand, this kind of analysis takes time. And if you're planning to use it in court, I'll need to document everything properly. Jordan glanced at me, and I nodded. How long? I asked. She considered. A week, maybe 2. Depends on what I find. And I'll need a retainer up front. My rates aren't cheap. I didn't hesitate. Whatever it costs, I'll pay it. Elena's tone softened slightly. All right. Bring me the documents tomorrow. I'll start as soon as I have them. Jordan thanked her and hung up. I felt the weight in my chest ease slightly, just enough to breathe. For the first time since walking out of Thomas Whitmore's office, I felt like I had a direction, a plan that wasn't just reactive grief. Jordan refilled my coffee and sat down across from me. You're going to need more than a handwriting expert, he said. You need a lawyer who specializes in probate and estate disputes. Someone who knows how to challenge a will in court. I pulled out the business card Thomas Whitmore had given me at the end of our meeting. He had mentioned another attorney, someone who handled contested estates. I found the name scrawled on the back in his neat handwriting. Malcolm Reeves, probate litigation. Jordan took the card and looked it up on his phone. His office is downtown near Pioneer Courthouse Square. Good reviews, lots of experience with inheritance disputes. He looked up at me. You want me to call him? I shook my head. I'll do it. This is my fight. I need to own it. The next morning, I sat in Malcolm Reeves' office on the 12th floor of a sleek glass building that overlooked the city. His office was modern, minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Malcolm himself was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with dark hair graying at the temples and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened while I explained the situation, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Contesting a will is difficult, he said bluntly. The burden of proof is on you. You'll need to demonstrate either undue influence, lack of capacity, or fraud. Do you have evidence of any of those? I told him about the signature, about Elena's preliminary observations, about the timeline of David's visits to Pine Ridge. Malcolm's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. That's a start, he said. But you'll need more. Medical records showing your mother's mental state at the time the will was signed. Witness testimony from staff at the care facility. Documentation of your brother's access and behavior during that period. And ideally evidence of the original will, if one existed. I frowned. Original will? Malcolm nodded. Most people don't just create a will out of nowhere when they're in declining health. If your parents had an estate plan before your mother went into care, there should be a record of it. Find that, and you'll have something to compare against. I thought about my parents' filing cabinet at the house, the one in my father's old workshop. It was where he kept everything important. Tax returns, insurance policies, warranties for appliances that had long since broken down. If there was an earlier will, it would be there. But the house was locked, and David had made it clear I wasn't welcome. Malcolm seemed to read my mind. "You'll need access to the house," he said. "Legally, you're entitled to retrieve personal belongings. I can draft a letter to your brother's attorney demanding access. If he refuses, we can file a motion with the court. It'll take time, but it's the proper channel." I nodded, though the idea of waiting for legal letters and court motions made my skin crawl. Malcolm pulled out a contract and slid it across the desk. "This is my retainer agreement. I'll need $5,000 up front, and my hourly rate is $300. If this goes to trial, costs will increase significantly." I looked at the number and felt my stomach drop. $5,000 was more than I had in savings. My job as a paramedic paid decently, but not enough to build a cushion, especially after helping cover my mother's care facility bills in her final months. I must have hesitated too long, because Malcolm's expression softened slightly. "I understand this is a lot," he said. "But if you're serious about contesting this will, you need proper representation. Without it, you're just shouting into the wind." I signed the contract and wrote him a check, watching my savings account balance drop to nearly zero in my mind. Malcolm took the check and filed it efficiently. "I'll start drafting the access letter today. In the meantime, gather everything you can. Photos, emails, text messages, medical records, anything that shows your mother's wishes or your brother's behavior. The more documentation you have, the stronger your case." I left his office feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I had a plan, a professional on my side. Heavier because the reality of what I was about to undertake had just become tangible. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or sibling rivalry. This was a legal battle that would cost me everything I had, financially and emotionally. Jordan was waiting for me in the lobby, 2 coffees in hand. He handed me one, and we walked out into the gray Portland morning. "How'd it go?" he asked. I told him about Malcolm's advice, about the need to access the house, about the retainer that had just emptied my bank account. Jordan listened and nodded slowly. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you are." We walked in silence for a while, the city waking up around us, people hurrying to work with umbrellas and coffee cups. I thought about my parents, about the life they had built in that craftsman house, about the promises my mother had made when her mind was still clear. She had told me the house was mine. She had said it while we sat in the garden, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes focused and present. "You'll take care of it, won't you, Rachel?" she had said. "It deserves someone who loves it." I had promised her I would. And now, standing in the rain with a half-empty coffee cup and a lawyer's retainer agreement in my bag, I renewed that promise silently. I would fight for that house. Not because I needed it, not because I wanted to win against David, but because my mother had trusted me with it, and I wasn't going to let her down. Jordan seemed to sense the shift in my mood. He bumped my shoulder gently. "Come on," he said. "Let's go see Elena. Time to find out if your instincts are right about that signature." We drove across town to a nondescript office building near the Lloyd district. Elena's office was on the 3rd floor, a small suite with her name stenciled on the frosted glass door. Inside, the space was organized chaos, filing cabinets lining the walls, a large desk covered in documents and magnifying equipment, and a lightbox mounted on the wall displaying what looked like an old letter. Elena herself was a small woman in her 50s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and glasses that magnified her sharp brown eyes. She greeted us with a firm handshake and got straight to business. "Let me see what you've got," she said. I handed her the folder with the will, and she carried it to her desk, pulling on a pair of latex gloves before touching the paper. She examined the signature under a high-powered magnifying lamp, occasionally making notes on a pad beside her. Jordan and I stood quietly, watching her work. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up. "This is interesting," she said. "Very interesting." Elena adjusted the lamp over the document, the white light casting sharp shadows across the paper. She pointed to the signature with a wooden probe, careful not to touch the ink directly. "Look at the baseline here," she said. "A genuine signature maintains a relatively consistent baseline, even when the writer's hand is shaky. This signature dips and rises erratically, not in the pattern you'd see from tremor or weakness, but from someone lifting and repositioning the pen multiple times. That's a telltale sign of tracing or copying. I leaned closer, squinting at the letters. My mother's name seemed to waver on the page, the M starting strong but faltering halfway through. Can you prove it in court? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elena removed her glasses and met my eyes. I can testify to my findings, yes. But I'll need comparison samples. Do you have any documents with your mother's genuine signature from around the same time period? Letters, checks, medical forms, anything dated within 6 months of this will. I thought hard, mentally cataloging everything I had taken from the house before David changed the locks. There wasn't much. A few photo albums, my mother's favorite cardigan, a jewelry box with her wedding ring. Then I remembered the birthday card. My mother had given it to me 8 months before she passed, back when she was still having good days. It was for my 32nd birthday, and she had written a message inside in her own hand. I still have a birthday card she wrote to me, I said. It's dated about 5 months before the will was supposedly signed. Would that work? Elena's expression brightened. That's perfect. The closer the dates, the better. Bring it to me, along with any other samples you can find. I'll need at least 3 comparison documents to make a solid case, but even one is a start. I'll analyze the letter formation, the pressure patterns, the pen lifts. If this signature is forged, I'll be able to demonstrate it conclusively. Jordan pulled out his phone and started recording notes. What else do we need? Medical records showing her cognitive state? Elena nodded. Absolutely. If you can obtain records from Pine Ridge showing her mental capacity at the time of signing, that will support the forgery claim. Dementia patients often have moments of clarity, but if the medical notes indicate she was significantly impaired during the period this will was executed, it raises serious questions about whether she could have understood what she was signing. I made a mental note to contact Pine Ridge as soon as possible. The facility had been my second home for nearly a year, and I knew several of the nurses by name. If anyone would help me access those records, it would be them. Elena carefully placed the will back into a protective sleeve and handed it to me. Guard this with your life, she said. It's your most important piece of evidence right now. I'm going to write up my preliminary findings and send them to your attorney. In the meantime, get me those comparison samples as quickly as you can. We thanked her and left, stepping back out into the gray afternoon. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, the kind that hung in the air like mist. Jordan walked beside me in silence for a moment before speaking. You're building a case, Rachel. Piece by piece. I know it doesn't feel like enough yet, but you're doing this right. I wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. David had money, connections, and a confidence that came from never having been told he was wrong. I had a depleted bank account, a lawyer I'd just hired, and a growing folder of suspicions that weren't yet proof. That evening, I sat in my small apartment in the Hawthorne district, the birthday card from my mother spread open on the kitchen table. The message inside was written in blue ink, the letters slanting slightly to the right in the way she had always written. My dearest Rachel, it read. Another year older, another year wiser, another year of making me proud. You have always been my steady one, my helper, my heart. I love you more than words can say. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Mom. Her signature at the bottom was clear and confident, the M flowing naturally into the rest of her name. I compared it to a photo I had taken of the will signature on my phone. The difference was stark. The card signature was fluid, relaxed. The will signature was stilted, uneven, forced. I took several high-resolution photos of the card under good lighting, making sure every detail was captured. Then I carefully placed it in a protective plastic sleeve and added it to the growing file of documents I was assembling. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. Managed to get the contact info for Patricia Thornton, your parents' original estate attorney. She retired 2 years ago, but still lives in the area. Want me to reach out? I replied immediately. Yes. If anyone knows what my parents' original wishes were, it's her. The next morning, I drove out to Pine Ridge Memory Care Facility, a low-slung building surrounded by gardens and walking paths designed to feel more like a retreat than a medical facility. The lobby smelled faintly of lavender and lemon cleaner, and soft music played from hidden speakers. I approached the front desk where a young woman with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Hi, I'm Rachel Bennett," I said. "My mother, Margaret Bennett, was a resident here until she passed 2 months ago. I need to request copies of her medical records from her final year." The receptionist's expression softened. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Let me get the forms you'll need to fill out." She handed me a clipboard with a records request form, and I filled it out carefully, checking every box that applied. When I handed it back, she reviewed it and nodded. "This will take about a week to process. We'll mail the records to the address you listed." I hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Is Nurse Carolyn working today?" The receptionist glanced at a schedule on her desk. "She's on the second floor. Would you like me to call her down?" A few minutes later, Carolyn appeared in the lobby. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and a warm smile that had comforted me through some of the hardest days of my mother's decline. She pulled me into a brief hug. "Rachel, it's good to see you. How are you holding up?" I managed a smile. "I'm managing. Can we talk privately for a minute?" She led me to a small consultation room off the main hallway and closed the door. I told her about the will, about the suspicious signature, about the timeline that didn't make sense. Carolyn listened, her face growing more serious with each detail I shared. "I remember the day that man came to see your mother," she said slowly. "He claimed he was a notary, brought a stack of papers with him. Your mother was having a bad day. She didn't even recognize him at first." I raised my head sharply. "You were there when the will was signed?" Carolyn shook her head. "Not in the room, no. He asked for privacy, said it was a legal matter. But I was at the nurse's station right outside, and I remember thinking it was odd. Your mother wasn't in any condition to be signing legal documents that day. She could barely hold a conversation." My heart began to race. "Would you be willing to testify to that? To what you saw and what you remember about her condition?" Carolyn didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Your mother was a wonderful woman, and if someone took advantage of her when she was vulnerable, that's not right. I'll do whatever I can to help." I felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick. "You have no idea what this means." She squeezed my hand. "Your mother loved you very much, Rachel. She talked about you all the time. Whatever happened with that will, I know it wasn't what she wanted." I left Pine Ridge with Carolyn's contact information saved in my phone, and a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces were coming together slowly but surely. That afternoon, I met Jordan at a coffee shop near Powell's Books. He was already seated at a corner table, 2 laptops open in front of him, his expression focused. He looked up when I approached and gestured to the empty chair. "I found something," he said without preamble. "I've been digging into Amanda Price, the notary who supposedly witnessed your mother's signature. Guess what? Her notary license was suspended 6 months ago for improper documentation." I felt my breath catch. "Suspended? For what?" Jordan turned one of the laptops toward me, showing a public records database. "She notarized documents without being physically present, which is illegal. Someone filed a complaint, the state investigated, and her license was revoked pending a hearing. As of right now, she's not legally allowed to notarize anything." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. So if she notarized my mother's will during the suspension period, the entire document could be invalid. Jordan nodded grimly. "Exactly. And if she notarized it before the suspension but did so improperly, it's still grounds to challenge the will's validity. Either way, this is huge." I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the screen. "Malcolm needs to see this immediately." Jordan closed the laptop and leaned back. "There's more." I looked through Amanda's social media, and she's been posting pictures from inside your parents' house for the past 2 months. Pictures of her cooking in the kitchen, sitting in the living room, even sleeping in what looks like the master bedroom. She's not just visiting, Rachel. She's living there. The anger that flared in my chest was hot and sharp. I thought of my mother's bedroom, the quilt she had made by hand, the photos on the nightstand of our family vacations. The idea of Amanda Price sleeping in that room, erasing my mother's presence with her own, made me feel physically ill. "Can you download those photos?" I asked. "All of them, with timestamps." Jordan was already moving, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Already on it. I'm creating a folder with everything I found on her. Social media posts, court records, the notary suspension documents. It's all going into your case file. We spent the next 2 hours combing through every detail, cross-referencing dates, building timelines, and documenting inconsistencies. By the time we left the coffee shop, I had a USB drive full of evidence and a list of follow-up tasks that felt both overwhelming and empowering. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the past few weeks over and over. The shock of the will reading, the discovery of the forged signature, the growing mountain of evidence that my brother had stolen everything my parents had built. But beneath the anger and the grief, there was something else. A cold, clear determination that settled into my bones like steel. David had underestimated me. He thought I would accept his version of events, that I would fade quietly into the background and let him enjoy the spoils of his deception. He thought I was weak. He was wrong. The next morning, Malcolm called me into his office. He was standing by the window when I arrived, his expression unreadable. "I've reviewed the information you and Jordan gathered," he said. "The notary suspension, the social media posts, the nurse's statement, the handwriting analysis. This is exactly what we need." He turned to face me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something like approval in his eyes. "You've built the foundation of a strong case, Rachel. Now we need to move quickly before your brother realizes what's coming." He walked to his desk and pulled out a document. "I've drafted a motion to compel access to the family home. We're filing it this afternoon. Once the judge signs off, your brother will have no choice but to let you in. And when you get in there, I want you to document everything. Take photos, make lists, look for the original will if it exists. Anything that can support your claim." I nodded, adrenaline already coursing through my veins. "What about the notary issue? Can we use that to invalidate the will immediately?" Malcolm shook his head. "It's not that simple. We'll need to prove that her suspension was in effect at the time she notarized the document, or that she committed fraud in the notarization process. That requires depositions, expert testimony, and a formal hearing. It's a strong argument, but it's not a silver bullet. However, combined with the handwriting analysis and the medical records showing your mother's incapacity, we have a compelling case for undue influence and fraud." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "How long until we go to court?" Malcolm sat down and opened a calendar on his desk. "If everything moves smoothly, we're looking at a preliminary hearing in about 6 weeks. That's where we'll present our evidence and argue for why the will should be set aside. If the judge agrees, we move to a full trial. If not, we appeal. Either way, this is going to be a long fight." I met his eyes. "I'm ready." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you are. Just remember, your brother is going to fight back. He'll hire his own experts, his own attorneys. He'll try to discredit you, paint you as a disgruntled sibling who's bitter about not getting what you think you deserve. You need to be prepared for that." I thought about the night on the highway in the original story I had read, about Opaline standing in the rain while her sister drove away. I thought about the strength it took to stay calm, to plan instead of react, to turn humiliation into power. I wasn't Opaline, and my story wasn't hers. But I understood now what she had understood that night. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, about honoring promises made to the dying, about refusing to let cruelty win. "I'm ready," I said again, and this time I meant it with every fiber of my being. Malcolm handed me a copy of the motion to compel access, and I left his office feeling like a soldier heading into battle. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time since that day in the law office, I felt like I had the weapons I needed to fight. And I wasn't fighting alone. Jordan was waiting for me outside the building, leaning against his truck with a coffee in each hand. He handed me one and raised his own in a mock toast. "To justice," he said. I clinked my cup against his. "To justice," I echoed. "And to my mother, who deserved better than this." We drove back across the city, the rain picking up again, the sky dark and heavy. But inside the truck, with the heater running and the evidence folder on my lap, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind that shatters at the first sign of resistance, but the solid, unshakable kind that comes from knowing you're on the right side of the truth. David had taken everything from me. The house, the money, the tangible remnants of my parents' lives. But he hadn't taken the one thing that mattered most. He hadn't taken my resolve. And that, I was beginning to realize, was the only weapon I truly needed. The motion to compel access was granted 3 days later. Malcolm called me with the news while I was restocking supplies in the ambulance between calls. The judge signed the order this morning, he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Your brother has 48 hours to provide you access to the family home, supervised or unsupervised, for the purpose of retrieving personal belongings and reviewing estate documents. If he refuses, he'll be in contempt of court. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of relief and apprehension. When can I go? Malcolm's tone became more serious. I'd suggest going as soon as possible, and I'd recommend bringing a witness. Jordan, perhaps, or someone else who can corroborate what you find. Take photos of everything. If you locate the original will or any other relevant documents, don't remove them. Photograph them in place, then take them with proper documentation. We need to maintain a clear chain of custody for anything that might be used as evidence. That evening, Jordan and I stood on the porch of the Selwood house, the court order folded in my jacket pocket. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the front yard. The porch light flickered on, and a moment later, David opened the door. He was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, but his expression was anything but relaxed. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. You've got 2 hours, he said flatly. And I'm staying here the entire time. I'm not letting you wander around unsupervised, planting evidence or making up stories. I held up my phone, the recording app already running. That's fine. Jordan and I just want to document what's here and retrieve some of my mother's personal items. David's eyes flicked to the phone, then to Jordan, who stood behind me with a camera bag slung over his shoulder. Whatever, David muttered, stepping aside. Just stay out of the master bedroom. That's my space now. The words hit me like a slap, but I kept my face neutral. I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of the house washed over me. Lavender and old wood, the scent of home. But it felt different now, violated somehow, as if the walls themselves knew they were being occupied by someone who didn't belong. Jordan followed me in, immediately beginning to take wide-angle shots of each room. I walked slowly through the living room, noting what had changed. My mother's collection of ceramic birds was gone from the mantel, replaced by a modern abstract sculpture that looked expensive and soulless. The family photos that had lined the hallway were missing, the walls now bare except for a few pieces of generic art. In the kitchen, Amanda's presence was everywhere. Her yoga mat leaned against the pantry door, her vitamins lined up on the counter, her coffee mug in the sink. I photographed it all, narrating quietly into my phone's recorder. Evidence of cohabitation. Amanda Price's personal belongings throughout the home. Removal of family photographs and heirlooms. David followed us from room to room, his arms crossed, his expression growing more agitated with each photo Jordan took. You're wasting your time, he said. The will is legal. You're just dragging this out because you can't accept that Mom and Dad didn't trust you with their estate. I didn't respond. Engaging with him would only derail what I came here to do. Instead, I walked down the hallway to my father's old workshop. The door was closed, and when I tried the handle, it was locked. I turned to David. I need access to the workshop. That's where Dad kept all the important documents. David shook his head. There's nothing in there but old tools and junk. You don't need to go in there. I pulled the court order from my pocket and held it up. The order says I have access to the entire house for the purpose of reviewing estate documents. If you refuse, you're in contempt. David's face flushed red, but after a tense moment, he pulled a key ring from his pocket and unlocked the door. The workshop smelled of sawdust and motor oil, exactly as I remembered. My father's tools still hung on the pegboard, organized with the precision of a man who believed everything had its place. In the corner sat his old filing cabinet, a battered metal beast that had probably been there since before I was born. I walked to the cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. It was stuffed with files, some neatly labeled, others crammed in haphazardly. I started pulling them out one by one, photographing the labels before opening them. Tax returns from 10 years ago. Warranty information for a refrigerator we no longer owned. Insurance policies that had lapsed. Then in the second drawer, tucked behind a folder of old utility bills, I found it. A legal document with the header Last Will and Testament of Robert and Margaret Bennett. The date on the document was 8 years old, long before my mother's decline. My hands trembled as I opened it. The language was clear and straightforward. Upon our deaths, the Selwood house and all its contents shall pass to our daughter, Rachel Marie Bennett. Our son, David Robert Bennett, shall receive the investment portfolio and savings accounts in equal value to the property. This division reflects our desire to ensure both children are cared for according to their needs and contributions to this family. My mother's signature was at the bottom, clear and confident, utterly unlike the shaky forgery on the newer will. Beside it was my father's signature, equally strong. I looked up at Jordan, who had moved closer to see what I'd found. He met my eyes and gave a slight nod. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the proof you needed." I carefully photographed every page of the document, making sure the date, the signatures, and every clause were clearly visible. Then I placed it in a protective folder and added it to my bag. David had been standing in the doorway, but now he stepped forward, his face pale. "What is that?" His voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something that sounded almost like panic. "This is our parents' original will," I said evenly. "The one they created when they were both healthy and of sound mind. The one that leaves the house to me." David's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I could see his mind racing, trying to calculate his next move. Finally, he found his voice. "That will is outdated. They changed their minds. The new will supersedes it." I met his gaze steadily. "Then you won't mind explaining to a judge why Mom's signature on the new will looks nothing like her signature on this one? Or why the notary who supposedly witnessed it had her license suspended for fraud? Or why Mom was barely coherent the day she allegedly signed away her home?" The color drained from David's face. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I continued searching through the filing cabinet, pulling out more documents. Bank statements showing modest but stable accounts. A folder labeled house deed with the original deed to the property, showing my parents as joint owners. And then, tucked in the very back of the bottom drawer, I found a handwritten letter. It was addressed to me, in my mother's handwriting, dated just 6 months before she went into Pine Ridge. "My dearest Rachel," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone or close to it. I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You've always been the steady one, the one who puts others first, the one who shows up when things get hard. Your brother has his strengths, but responsibility isn't one of them. That's why your father and I decided the house should go to you. We know you'll take care of it, honor it, keep it in the family the way it deserves. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. This house is yours, and it always has been in our hearts. I love you more than words can say, Mom." I read the letter twice, tears blurring my vision. Jordan placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and grounding. I photographed the letter, then placed it carefully with the original will. When I turned back to David, his expression had shifted from panic to something uglier. Anger, resentment, and beneath it all, fear. "You always were her favorite," he spat. "Nothing I did was ever good enough. She always ran to you, always trusted you more. This is just more of the same." I felt a flicker of pity for him, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of everything he had done. "You had the same opportunities one did, David. You chose to use them differently. And when Mom needed help, when she needed someone to show up every day and hold her hand while her mind slipped away, where were you? You were busy planning how to steal everything she wanted to leave to me." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice shaking. I turned and walked past him, Jordan following close behind. "It's not your house," I said quietly as I passed. "It never was." We left the workshop and continued documenting the rest of the house. In the dining room, I found my grandmother's china cabinet, but the china itself was missing. The cabinet that had held my mother's jewelry was in her bedroom, but David had claimed he couldn't let me in there. I noted it all, photographing the empty spaces, the missing heirlooms, the systematic erasure of my family's history. By the time we finished, the 2 hours had passed, and the sun had set completely. David stood by the front door, his arms crossed, watching us with barely contained hostility. I stopped in front of him before leaving. "You're going to lose, David. You know that, don't you? The will is forged, the notary was fraudulent, and I have evidence that Mom never wanted this. You can keep fighting, but all you're doing is digging yourself deeper." David's jaw worked, but he said nothing. I walked out into the night, Jordan beside me, the folder of documents clutched tightly in my hands. We drove in silence for several blocks before Jordan finally spoke. "That was the original will, wasn't it? The real one?" I nodded. "And the letter from Mom? It's everything Malcolm said we needed. Proof of her actual wishes, proof that the new will contradicts it, proof that she was clear-minded when she made her real intentions known." Jordan pulled into a parking lot and turned to face me. "You did it, Rachel. You found the smoking gun. Now you take it to court and you finish this." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but Malcolm managed to expedite it based on the new evidence. Within 3 weeks, I found myself sitting in a Multnomah County courtroom, the original will, and my mother's letter laid out on the table in front of Malcolm. Across the aisle, David sat with his attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Victoria Chun who specialized in estate litigation. David wouldn't meet my eyes, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Holloway, entered the courtroom, and we all rose. She settled behind the bench and reviewed the case file in front of her. "This is a motion to set aside the will of Margaret Bennett on grounds of forgery, undue influence, and lack of testamentary capacity," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I've reviewed the preliminary briefs from both sides. Let's proceed with opening statements." Malcolm stood and approached the bench. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the will currently on file was created through fraud and deception. The signature of Margaret Bennett was forged at a time when she lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid will. The notary who supposedly witnessed the document had her license suspended for fraudulent practices. And most importantly, we have the original will, executed 8 years prior when Mrs. Bennett was of sound mind, which tells a completely different story about her wishes." Victoria Chun rose to respond. "Your Honor, the will in question was properly executed, witnessed, and filed according to Oregon law. The petitioner is engaging in a fishing expedition based on speculation and sibling rivalry. Mrs. Bennett had every right to change her will, and the fact that the petitioner disagrees with that decision doesn't make it invalid." Judge Holloway listened to both arguments, then turned to Malcolm. "I'd like to see this original will you mentioned." Malcolm handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. She read through it carefully, her expression giving nothing away. Then she looked up. "This will is dated 8 years ago and clearly states the house should pass to the petitioner, Rachel Bennett. Do you have evidence that Mrs. Bennett explicitly revoked this will?" Victoria Chun stood again. "The newer will, dated 3 months before Mrs. Bennett's death, supersedes any prior wills. That's standard legal practice, Your Honor." Judge Holloway nodded slowly. "That's correct, but only if the newer will was validly executed. I'm concerned about the allegations regarding the notary and the signature." She turned to Malcolm. "I assume you have expert testimony on the signature analysis?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic document examiner, has analyzed both signatures and will testify that the signature on the newer will is inconsistent with Mrs. Bennett's known handwriting and shows signs of forgery." The judge made a note. "And what about the notary issue?" Malcolm pulled out the records Jordan had compiled. The notary, Amanda Price, had her license suspended by the state of Oregon 2 months before the alleged date of execution. She was legally prohibited from notarizing any documents during that period. If she notarized this will, it was done fraudulently. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria Chun's face tightened, and she leaned over to whisper urgently to David. Judge Holloway raised her hand for silence. "These are serious allegations. I'm going to allow a full evidentiary hearing on this matter. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks, and I want both sides prepared to present witnesses and documentation. In the meantime, The estate remains frozen. No assets are to be transferred or sold until this matter is resolved. The gavel came down, and I felt a surge of something that was equal parts relief and vindication. This wasn't over yet, but the judge was taking the allegations seriously. David stood abruptly and stormed out of the courtroom without a word, Victoria Chen hurrying after him. Malcolm turned to me, a slight smile on his face. That went better than I expected. The judge is clearly skeptical of the newer will. If Elena's testimony holds up, and if we can prove Amanda Price notarized the document illegally, we have a strong chance of getting the original will reinstated. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. News of the case had spread through the local legal community, and several reporters sat in the gallery, notebooks in hand. Elena Vasquez took the stand first, calm and professional in a dark suit. Malcolm walked her through her credentials, then displayed enlarged photographs of both signatures on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. Dr. Vasquez, can you explain the differences you observed between these two signatures? Malcolm asked. Elena adjusted her glasses and pointed to the screen. The signature on the original will shows consistent pressure, fluid motion, and natural variation consistent with genuine handwriting. The signature on the contested will shows hesitation marks, uneven pressure, and mechanical repetition that suggests tracing or careful copying rather than natural signing. She walked the court through a detailed analysis, pointing out specific letters where the pen had lifted and repositioned, where the ink pooled from hesitation, where the line quality changed abruptly. In my professional opinion, she concluded, the signature on the contested will was not written by Margaret Bennett. It is a simulation of her signature, likely traced or copied from another document. Victoria Chen stood for cross-examination. Dr. Vasquez, isn't it possible that Mrs. Bennett's signature simply changed due to age, illness, or medication? Elena remained composed. While handwriting can deteriorate with age or illness, the deterioration follows predictable patterns. Shakiness, wandering baseline, inconsistent letter size. What we see here is not deterioration. It's deliberate mimicry. The two are forensically distinct. Victoria pressed harder, but Elena's testimony held firm. When she stepped down, Malcolm called Carolyn, the nurse from Pine Ridge. Carolyn described the day the will was supposedly signed, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Mrs. Bennett was having a very difficult day. She was confused, agitated, unable to focus. When the man arrived with papers for her to sign, I was concerned. She wasn't in any condition to understand legal documents. Did you express your concerns? Malcolm asked. I mentioned it to him, yes. He told me it was just a formality, that Mrs. Bennett had already agreed to everything, and this was just finalizing it. He said it would only take a minute. I should have insisted on staying in the room, but he asked for privacy and I complied. I've regretted that ever since. The courtroom was silent. Even Victoria Chen seemed at a loss for how to challenge the testimony. Malcolm thanked Carolyn and called his final witness, Patricia Thornton, my parents' original estate attorney. Patricia was a small woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She testified that she had drafted the original will at my parents' request 8 years ago. They were very clear about their wishes, she said. Margaret wanted the house to go to Rachel because Rachel had always been the caretaker, the one who would preserve the family home. David was to receive the financial assets, which were substantial at the time. It was a fair division based on each child's strengths and needs. Malcolm asked, did the Bennetts ever contact you about changing their will? Patricia shook her head firmly. Never. I remained their attorney of record until I retired, and they never once indicated they wanted to make changes. If they had, I would have drawn up the new documents myself. The fact that they went to someone else, or that someone else drafted this will without their knowledge, raises serious red flags. When Malcolm rested his case, Victoria Chen called only one witness, David himself. He took the stand looking pale and drawn, his earlier confidence gone. Under Victoria's questioning, he claimed that his mother had told him she wanted to change the will, that she felt Rachel was too irresponsible with money, that she trusted him to manage the estate properly. But under Malcolm's cross-examination, his story fell apart. Malcolm produced phone records showing David had called Amanda Price multiple times in the weeks before the will was allegedly signed. He produced bank records showing David had withdrawn $15,000 in cash the week after his mother's death. And then he produced the letter, my mother's handwritten letter to me, and read it aloud in the courtroom. David's face crumpled as the words filled the space. He tried to claim the letter was old, that my mother had changed her mind later, but his voice cracked and he couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Judge Holloway called for closing arguments. Malcolm stood and addressed the court with quiet intensity. Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. The will presented by David Bennett is a fraud, executed by a notary whose license was suspended, bearing a forged signature, created at a time when Margaret Bennett lacked the capacity to understand what she was signing. The original will, created when she was healthy and clear-minded, reflects her true wishes. Justice demands that the original will be reinstated, and that the respondent be held accountable for his actions. Victoria Chen's closing was weaker, relying on technicalities and the legal presumption that a later will supersedes an earlier one. But even she seemed to know the battle was lost. Judge Holloway took less than an hour to deliberate. When she returned, the courtroom fell silent. After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, I find that the will dated 3 months before Margaret Bennett's death is invalid. The signature appears to be forged, the notary was not properly licensed, and the testimony indicates Mrs. Bennett lacked testamentary capacity at the time of alleged execution. The original will, dated 8 years prior, is hereby reinstated as the valid last will and testament of Margaret and Robert Bennett. The Selwood House and its contents passed to Rachel Bennett. The financial assets passed to David Bennett as originally specified. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation into forgery and fraud. The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in murmurs. I sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Malcolm placed a hand on my shoulder. You won, Rachel. The house is yours. David sat motionless across the aisle, his head in his hands. Victoria Chen gathered her papers and left without a word. I stood on shaky legs and walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sunlight. Jordan was waiting outside, and when he saw my face, he broke into a wide smile. You did it, he said, pulling me into a hug. I did, I whispered, and finally the tears came. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, of vindication, of a weight lifting that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. 6 months later, I stood in the garden of the Selwood house, planting roses the way my mother used to. The house had been cleaned, the locks changed, Amanda's belongings removed. I had donated most of the furniture David had brought in, and slowly begun restoring the house to the way it had been. My mother's china was back in the cabinet, her photos back on the walls. The workshop had been turned into an office where I spent my evenings working on a new project. I had partnered with Jordan and Elena to start a nonprofit organization called the Bennett Foundation, dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly individuals from financial exploitation and estate fraud. We offered free legal consultations, document verification services, and education programs for families navigating the complicated world of elder care and estate planning. The foundation was named after my parents, a way to honor their memory and ensure that what happened to our family wouldn't happen to others. We had already helped a dozen families contest fraudulent wills, recover stolen assets, and hold perpetrators accountable. David had been charged with fraud and forgery. He pled guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution. Amanda Price faced separate charges for notary fraud. The financial assets that were rightfully his according to the original will had been depleted by legal fees and restitution payments. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet sadness for what might have been if he had chosen differently. I wiped the soil from my hands and stood back to admire the row of rose bushes. They were my mother's favorite variety, deep red with a fragrance that filled the entire garden. In my pocket, my phone buzzed with a message from Jordan. We just signed our 20th client. This foundation is really taking off. Are you free for coffee tomorrow to discuss expansion plans? I smiled and typed back a reply. Always. See you at the Riverfront Cafe. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, light and gentle, washing the dust from the rose leaves. I tilted my face up to it, letting it cool my skin, and thought about how far I had come from that day in the lawyer's office when I thought I had lost everything. I hadn't lost. I had fought, and I had won. But more than that, I had transformed my pain into purpose, my anger into action. The house behind me was more than just wood and brick. It was a symbol of perseverance, of honoring those who came before, of refusing to let cruelty and deception win. I walked back inside, my boots leaving muddy prints on the porch, and closed the door behind me. The house welcomed me home, the way it always had, the way it always would. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my mother was proud. The Bennett Foundation occupied a modest office space in Northeast Portland, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a small cafe that served the best Ethiopian coffee in the city. The sign outside was simple, just our name and mission statement etched in clean letters on frosted glass. Inside, the walls were painted a warm cream color, and we had furnished the space with comfortable chairs and a large conference table, where families could sit and discuss their cases without feeling intimidated by sterile corporate surroundings. On one wall hung framed photographs of my parents in happier times, along with letters from clients we had helped, each one a reminder of why this work mattered. Elena had come on board as our lead forensic consultant, splitting her time between her private practice and pro bono work for the foundation. Jordan handled operations and outreach, using his natural warmth and organizational skills to connect with families who needed help but didn't know where to turn. I managed the legal coordination, working with a network of attorneys who donated their time to take on cases that otherwise would have bankrupted the families involved. We had started small, but word spread quickly through senior centers, care facilities, and community organizations. 6 months after opening our doors, we were fielding calls from across Oregon, and even from neighboring states. Our most recent case involved an 82-year-old veteran named Harold Preston whose nephew had convinced him to sign over power of attorney, and then systematically drained his accounts. Harold's daughter, Christine, had discovered the theft when she visited her father, and found him living in squalor despite having a pension that should have kept him comfortable. She had come to us desperate and furious, clutching a folder of bank statements that showed thousands of dollars withdrawn for purchases her father never made. Jordan and I had visited Harold at his small apartment in Gresham, and the moment I saw him, frail and confused in a worn recliner, I thought of my mother. Harold's story was painfully familiar. His nephew had visited regularly, earned his trust, and then exploited his cognitive decline to steal everything he had worked for. But unlike my mother, Harold was still alive, still capable of testifying, still able to see justice done. We had connected Christine with one of our partner attorneys, a fierce advocate named Rebecca Walsh who specialized in elder abuse cases. Rebecca had filed for emergency guardianship, frozen Harold's accounts, and initiated criminal charges against the nephew. The case was still ongoing, but Harold had been moved to a safer living situation, and his daughter now had legal authority to protect him. Sitting in the foundation office on a rainy Thursday morning, I reviewed the case files spread across my desk. Each folder represented a family torn apart by greed, by betrayal, by the cruel exploitation of vulnerability. But each folder also represented a fight we were willing to take on, a family we were determined to help. My phone rang, and I answered to hear a trembling voice on the other end. "Hello, is this the Bennett Foundation? My name is Susan Morales, and I think my sister stole my mother's house. I need help." I grabbed a notepad and pen. "Tell me everything," I said gently. "Start from the beginning." Susan's story unfolded over the next 40 minutes. Her mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 3 years ago, and had been living with Susan until her sister, Teresa, had convinced their mother to move in with her instead. Within months, the mother's house had been sold, the proceeds vanishing into accounts Susan couldn't access. When she confronted Teresa, her sister had produced documents showing that their mother had given her financial power of attorney, and had wanted Teresa to manage everything. Susan had tried to hire a lawyer, but couldn't afford the retainer fees. She had been told by multiple attorneys that without significant upfront costs, there was nothing they could do. "I understand how overwhelming this must feel," I said. "But you're not alone anymore. We can help you. Can you come to our office tomorrow morning? Bring any documents you have, any emails or text messages with your sister, any records of your mother's medical condition. We'll review everything and figure out the best path forward." Susan's voice broke with relief. Thank you. I've been so scared that I just have to accept this, that she'd get away with it. You don't have to accept it, I said firmly. And if your sister did what you think she did, she won't get away with it. We'll make sure of that. After I hung up, Jordan appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on my desk and leaned against the doorframe. Another one? He asked. I nodded. Another one. It never stops, does it? The calls, the stories, the families being torn apart. Jordan took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. It doesn't stop because the problem is bigger than we realized. Elder financial abuse is an epidemic, and most of it goes unreported because families either don't know how to fight back or can't afford to. What we're doing here, it's just the beginning. We need to scale this up, get more resources, train more people. I knew he was right. The need was overwhelming, and our small operation could only handle so many cases at once. But scaling up required funding, and funding required visibility. I had been avoiding the media attention that had followed my own case, declining interview requests and keeping my head down. The last thing I wanted was to become the face of some sensationalized story about sibling rivalry and stolen inheritances. But Jordan had been gently pushing me to reconsider. Your story is powerful, Rachel, he had said more than once. If you shared it publicly, it could inspire other people to come forward, to fight back, to know they're not alone. And it could attract donors who want to support this work. I had resisted, but now looking at the stack of case files on my desk and thinking about Susan Morales' trembling voice, I wondered if he was right. That evening, I sat in the house that had nearly been stolen from me and drafted an essay. I wrote about my parents, about the night I learned I had been written out of their will, about the investigation that uncovered the fraud. I wrote about the original will hidden in my father's workshop, about my mother's letter, about the moment the judge ruled in my favor. But mostly, I wrote about what came after. The foundation, the families we were helping, the realization that my personal fight had become something bigger than myself. I published the essay on a blog platform that weekend, not expecting much response. By Monday morning, it had been shared thousands of times. My inbox was flooded with messages from people who had experienced similar situations, from journalists asking for interviews, from attorneys offering to volunteer their services, and from donors wanting to contribute to the foundation. The response was overwhelming and humbling. Jordan burst into the office that afternoon with his laptop, his face lit up with excitement. Rachel, you need to see this. A local news station wants to do a feature on the foundation. And we just got a $20,000 donation from someone who read your essay and wants to help us expand. I stared at the screen, hardly believing what I was seeing. $20,000. That was enough to hire a part-time case manager, to upgrade our database system, to take on twice as many clients. I looked up at Jordan. This is really happening, isn't it? He grinned. It's really happening. You started something, Rachel. Something that matters. The news feature aired 2 weeks later, a 10-minute segment that profiled the foundation and interviewed several of the families we had helped. Harold Preston appeared on camera, his daughter Christine beside him, and spoke about how we had saved him from losing everything. The reporter also interviewed me, asking about my own experience and what had motivated me to start the foundation. I had been nervous about the interview, worried about coming across as bitter or vindictive toward David. But when the cameras rolled, I found myself speaking from a place of clarity and purpose. What happened to my family was a tragedy, I said. But it taught me that the legal system, while imperfect, can deliver justice when you have the right support and resources. Too many families don't have that support. They're isolated, scared, and financially unable to fight back against people who exploit their loved ones. Our foundation exists to level that playing field, to give families the tools and expertise they need to protect the people they love. The segment ended with information about how to contact the foundation and how to donate. Within days, we had received enough contributions to lease a larger office space and hire 2 full-time staff members. Elena agreed to come on board permanently as our forensic director, and we brought on a retired probate judge named Gerald Hartman to serve as a legal advisor. The growth was exhilarating and exhausting, but it felt right. Every new case we took on, every family we helped, felt like another piece of healing for the wound that David's betrayal had left. One afternoon, about a year after the foundation had opened, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in the office reviewing a case file when our receptionist buzzed me. "Rachel, there's someone here to see you. He says his name is David Bennett." My heart stuttered in my chest. I hadn't seen or spoken to David since the day he was sentenced. He had been released early for good behavior after serving 18 months, and I had deliberately avoided any information about what he was doing or where he was living. Part of me had hoped I would never have to see him again. But another part of me, a part one didn't like to acknowledge, had wondered if this moment would come. I took a deep breath and told the receptionist to send him in. David appeared in the doorway a moment later, and I barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his face gaunt and lined in a way that made him look older than his 40 years. He was dressed simply in jeans and a plain jacket, nothing like the expensive suits he used to wear. His eyes, when they met mine, were hollow. "Rachel," he said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me." I didn't stand or offer him a seat. I just waited, my hands folded on the desk in front of me. He shifted uncomfortably. "I know I don't have any right to be here. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I needed to tell you in person that I'm sorry. For everything." The words hung in the air between us. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but all I saw was exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "Why now?" I asked. "Why come here after all this time?" David exhaled slowly. "Because I've spent the last year and a half thinking about what I did. About Mom and Dad. About you. About how I destroyed everything for money I didn't even get to keep. I told myself I deserved it, that I had earned it somehow, but that was a lie. I was jealous of you, Rachel. I always have been. Mom and Dad trusted you in a way they never trusted me, and instead of trying to earn that trust, I tried to take what you had. It was pathetic and cruel, and I'm sorry." I didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him that his apology meant nothing, that he had stolen more than money or property. He had stolen the chance to grieve our parents without the shadow of betrayal hanging over everything. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last year helping families heal from similar wounds, understood that holding on to anger would only poison me further. "I'm glad you're sorry," I said finally. "But an apology doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't give me back the time I spent fighting to prove Mom's wishes. It doesn't give Harold Preston back his savings or Christine Morales back her trust in her sister." David's face crumpled slightly. "I know. I just needed you to know that I see it now. What I did, what it cost." He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I don't have much, but I wanted to give this to your foundation. It's not enough, it'll never be enough, but maybe it can help someone." He placed the envelope on my desk. I looked at it but didn't touch it. Inside, I could see the corner of a check. "How much?" I asked. $5,000, he said. "It's most of what I've managed to save working construction since I got out. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I wanted it to go towards something that matters." I picked up the envelope and opened it. The check was real, made out to the Bennett Foundation in David's handwriting. I looked up at him. "Why the foundation? Why not just try to pay me back directly?" "Because this isn't about paying you back," he said. "I can never do that. But maybe if the money helps someone else avoid what we went through, it's worth something. Maybe it's a start toward being a better person than I was." I set the check down and leaned back in my chair. "What do you want from me, David? Forgiveness? Absolution?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to do better. That I understand what I took from you, from our family, from Mom's memory. And that I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once been my brother, who I had built forts with as a child, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had somehow become a stranger capable of cruelty I never imagined. "I don't forgive you," I said quietly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I accept your apology, and I'll accept this donation. Not for your sake, but for the families it will help." David nodded, and I saw his shoulders sag with something like relief. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Mom would be proud of what you're doing here." I know that doesn't mean much coming from me, but it's true. After he left, I sat alone in the office for a long time, staring at the check on my desk. Jordan found me there an hour later, the light outside fading to dusk. He saw the check and raised an eyebrow. "David?" I nodded. He came to apologize and to donate. Jordan sat down across from me. "How do you feel?" I thought about it, trying to untangle the knot of emotions in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted. Angry, sad, exhausted. But also maybe a little lighter. Like I can finally close that chapter. Jordan smiled gently. "That's healing, Rachel. It doesn't mean you have to forgive him or forget what he did. It just means you're not carrying it alone anymore." Over the next 2 years, the Bennett Foundation grew beyond anything I had imagined. We expanded to serve clients across the Pacific Northwest, partnered with law schools to provide legal clinics, and developed training programs for caregivers and family members to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. We successfully contested 37 fraudulent wills, recovered over $2 million in stolen assets, and helped secure criminal convictions in 12 cases of elder abuse. Each victory felt personal, a vindication not just for the families we served, but for my own journey. Harold Preston became one of our most vocal advocates, speaking at senior centers and community events about his experience, and encouraging others to seek help if they suspected abuse. Christine started volunteering with us, using her background in social work to provide emotional support to families navigating the legal system. Susan Morales won her case against her sister Teresa, and her mother's assets were returned and placed in a protected trust. These stories, and dozens of others like them, became the heartbeat of our work. On the 3rd anniversary of the Foundation's opening, we held a fundraising gala at a historic venue overlooking the Willamette River. The room was filled with donors, volunteers, attorneys, and families we had helped. Jordan stood at the podium and gave a speech about the Foundation's growth and impact, his voice strong and proud. Then he introduced me, and I walked to the front of the room to applause that felt both humbling and empowering. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, people who had believed in this mission, who had given their time and resources to make it real. 3 years ago, I walked into a lawyer's office and discovered that my brother had stolen my inheritance. I was devastated, angry, and lost. But I was also lucky. I had the resources to fight back, the knowledge to navigate the legal system, and the support of people who believed in me. Most families facing elder financial abuse don't have those advantages. They're isolated, overwhelmed, and convinced they're powerless. The Bennett Foundation exists to change that narrative, to tell families that they are not alone, that they do have power, and that justice is possible. I spoke about the families we had helped, about the systemic changes we were advocating for, about the future we were building. And I spoke about my parents, about the legacy they had left, not in money or property, but in the values they instilled. Kindness, integrity, the belief that we have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. This foundation is their legacy, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And every family we help, every case we win, every person we empower to stand up against exploitation, that's their memory living on. The applause was thunderous, and I stepped back from the podium with tears in my eyes. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I stood by the windows overlooking the river. The city lights reflected on the water, shimmering and beautiful, and I felt a profound sense of peace. Jordan joined me, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He handed me one and clinked his glass against mine. "To your parents," he said. "And to you. To all of us," I corrected. "This wouldn't exist without you, without Elena, without everyone who believed this was worth fighting for." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the river flow past. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from that devastating day in the lawyer's office to this moment of celebration and purpose. I thought about David, wherever he was, and hoped he was finding his own path toward redemption. I thought about my mother's letter, the words that had given me strength when I needed it most. "This house is yours, and it always has been in our hearts." She had been talking about more than just the physical structure. She had been talking about legacy, about trust, about the responsibility to honor those who came before us. The Selwood house still stood, lovingly maintained, a place where I returned every evening after long days at the foundation. I had considered selling it once, using the money to fund the foundation's expansion, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The house was more than an asset. It was a connection to my parents, a reminder of where I came from and why this work mattered. Instead, I had opened it occasionally for foundation events, turning the living room into a gathering space for support groups and the dining room into a place where families could share meals and stories. Standing by the river with Jordan, I realized that I had done what my mother had asked. I had taken care of the house, honored it, kept it alive with purpose and love. But more than that, I had taken the pain of what happened and transformed it into something meaningful. I had turned betrayal into advocacy, grief into action, loss into legacy. That's what justice looks like, I thought. Not just courtroom victories or financial restitution, but the quiet, persistent work of making sure others don't suffer the same harm. It's the choice to turn your wounds into wisdom, your anger into compassion, your personal fight into a movement that outlasts you. The foundation would continue to grow, to evolve, to reach more families. There would be more cases, more challenges, more nights when the work felt overwhelming. But there would also be more victories, more families reunited with their loved ones' legacies, more people empowered to stand up against exploitation. And every single one of those victories would be a testament to my parents, to the values they taught me, to the love they gave me even in death. I raised my glass to the city lights, to the river flowing endlessly forward, to the future we were building one case at a time. Jordan noticed the gesture and raised his glass as well. "What are we toasting?" he asked. I smiled. To transformation. To turning the worst moments of our lives into the best reasons to keep fighting. To proving that even when people try to steal everything from you, they can't take away your ability to choose how you respond. Jordan's expression softened. "That's beautiful, Rachel. And it's true. You've built something extraordinary here. Not just the foundation, but the way you've carried yourself through all of this. Your parents would be so proud." I felt tears prick my eyes again, but they were good tears, clean tears. "Thank you," I said simply. "For everything. For being there from the beginning. For believing in this when it was just an idea. For being the kind of friend who shows up with coffee and a camera and says, 'Let's do this.'" Jordan smiled. "That's what family does. And your family, Rachel. Not by blood, but by choice. By showing up. By fighting together." We finished our champagne as the last guests filtered out. And then we locked up the venue and walked to our cars in the quiet night. Driving home through the familiar streets of Portland, I thought about all the chapters of this story. The betrayal, the investigation, the courtroom battle, the foundation, the healing. Each one had been necessary. Each one had shaped me into the person I was now. And while I would never be grateful for what David did, I could acknowledge that it had led me here, to this work, to this purpose, to this life that felt fuller and more meaningful than anything I had imagined 3 years ago. When I pulled into the driveway of the Selwood house, the porch light was on, welcoming me home. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house my parents had built, the house my mother had entrusted to me, the house that had become both a sanctuary and a symbol. Then I got out, walked up the steps and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was as it should be. My mother's roses in a vase on the kitchen table. My father's workshop visible through the back window. The family photos lining the hallway, faces smiling out from happier times. I walked through the room slowly, touching the furniture, straightening a picture frame, feeling the presence of my parents in every corner. They were gone, but they weren't lost. They lived on in this house, in the foundation that bore their name, in every family we helped find justice. And they lived on in me, in the strength I had discovered, in the purpose I had claimed, in the refusal to let cruelty have the last word. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, exhausted but content, and looked out the window at the garden below. The roses my mother loved were blooming, their petals dark against the night. Tomorrow there would be more work, more cases, more families needing help. But tonight I let myself rest. I let myself feel the weight of everything I had carried, and the lightness of everything I had built. I let myself be proud of the woman I had become, the advocate my mother knew I could be, the keeper of a legacy that would outlast all of us. And as I drifted off to sleep, I thought one last time about that day in the lawyer's office, the day I thought I had lost everything. I had lost something that day, but I had also found something. I had found my voice, my strength, my purpose. I had found the courage to fight not just for myself, but for everyone who couldn't fight alone. That discovery, that transformation, was worth more than any inheritance. It was the true legacy my parents had left me, and it was the gift I would spend the rest of my life giving to others. Because in the end, justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about refusing to be broken by betrayal. It's about turning pain into purpose and loss into something that helps others heal. It's about honoring the people we love by becoming the kind of person they always believed we could be. And that, more than any house or money or legal victory, was what I had gained from this fight. That was what made it all worthwhile. The morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a long storm has finally passed. I woke in the bedroom that had once been my childhood sanctuary, now transformed into a space that reflected the woman I had become rather than the girl I had been. The walls were painted a soft sage green, and morning light filtered through linen curtains that moved gently in the breeze from the half-open window. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood waking up, the distant rumble of traffic on the main road, the chirping of sparrows in the maple trees, the rhythmic sound of someone jogging past with their dog. I got up and made coffee in the kitchen, using my mother's old percolator that still worked perfectly despite being older than I was. The ritual of measuring the grounds, filling the water reservoir, and waiting for that first hiss and bubble had become a meditation of sorts, a way to center myself before the demands of the day took over. While the coffee brewed, I checked my phone and found several messages waiting. One was from Elena, asking if I had reviewed the forensic analysis she had sent over for the Williamson case. Another was from Jordan, reminding me about the staff meeting scheduled for later that morning. And there was one from an unknown number that simply read, "Thank you for giving me my mother back." I stared at that last message for a long time, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever I was reminded of why this work mattered. Someone out there, someone whose name I might not even know, had been helped by the foundation. Their mother had been protected, their family had been made whole, and they had taken the time to reach out and let me know. These messages arrived regularly now, sometimes from clients we had worked with directly, sometimes from people who had read about us and found the courage to take action in their own situations. Each one felt like a small miracle, a confirmation that the path I had chosen was the right one. I poured my coffee and carried it out to the back porch, settling into the wooden chair my father had built decades ago. The garden stretched before me, a riot of color and life that I had slowly been restoring to its former glory. My mother had been an intuitive gardener, someone who seemed to understand what each plant needed without consulting books or guides. I had inherited her love of growing things but not her natural talent, so I had spent countless hours researching, experimenting, and occasionally failing spectacularly. But the effort had been worth it. The roses bloomed in deep reds and soft pinks. The lavender bushes hummed with bees. The vegetable patch in the corner produced more tomatoes and zucchini than I could possibly eat alone. Sitting there in the morning quiet, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had been 3 years since the court ruling that restored the original will, and in that time, my life had been completely transformed. The foundation had become more than just a project or a passion. It had become my calling, the thing that gave shape and meaning to every day. But it had also taught me things about myself that I hadn't known before. I had discovered reserves of patience I didn't know I possessed, learned to navigate complex legal systems with a confidence that would have seemed impossible years ago, and found that I had a gift for connecting with people in their most vulnerable moments. The work was exhausting, emotionally draining, and sometimes heartbreaking. Not every case ended in victory. Some families came to us too late, after the damage had already been done, and the legal avenues had closed. Some chose not to pursue justice because the cost, financial or emotional, was too high. And some cases revealed such depths of cruelty and betrayal that even winning felt hollow. But there were also the victories, the moments when justice prevailed and families were reunited with what had been stolen from them. Those moments made everything else worthwhile. I finished my coffee and went back inside to get ready for the day. The foundation office was a 20-minute drive from the house, and I liked to arrive early before the phone started ringing and the day's chaos took over. As I drove through the familiar streets of Southeast Portland, I thought about the staff meeting Jordan had scheduled. We had been discussing the possibility of opening a second location, possibly in Eugene or Salem, to serve families in the southern part of the state. The demand was there, the funding was increasingly stable thanks to grants and donations, but expansion meant new challenges. Hiring and training staff, establishing relationships with local courts and law enforcement, building trust in communities where we were unknown. It was the kind of problem I would have found overwhelming 3 years ago, but now it felt manageable, even exciting. I had learned that big challenges were just collections of smaller, solvable problems, and that progress happened one step at a time. When I arrived at the office, Elena was already there, her desk covered in documents and photographs. She looked up when I walked in and pushed her glasses up on her nose. "Morning, Rachel. Did you get a chance to look at the Williamson materials?" I set my bag down and pulled out my laptop. I did. The signature discrepancies are even more obvious than in our case. Do you think we have enough to move forward? Elena nodded firmly. Absolutely. The person who forged these documents wasn't even particularly skilled. There are hesitation marks, uneven pressure, and the baseline wanders all over the place. Add in the medical records showing Mr. Williamson's advanced Parkinson's, and there's no way he could have produced these signatures. We have a strong case. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. Let's schedule a meeting with the family and walk them through the findings. I want them to understand exactly what we've discovered and what the next steps look like. Elena made a note and returned to her work, and I headed to my office to prepare for the staff meeting. Jordan arrived a few minutes later with a box of pastries from the bakery down the street, a tradition he had started in the early days when we were working out of his garage, and sustenance was sometimes more important than strategy. He set the box on the conference table and grinned at me. "Fuel for the brain," he announced. "We've got a lot to cover today." The meeting lasted 2 hours and covered everything from case updates to budget projections to the logistics of potential expansion. Our newest hire, a young attorney named Marcus Chin, presented research he had done on elder law statutes in different counties, identifying areas where the legal framework was particularly weak and families were most vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of systemic analysis we needed if we were going to advocate for policy changes at the state level. Rebecca Walsh, who had joined us as a senior legal consultant, talked about a case she was preparing for trial, one that involved a caregiver who had systematically isolated an elderly woman from her family while draining her accounts. The details were horrifying, but Rebecca's determination was fierce. "We're going to nail this guy," she said, her voice hard. "He's done this before to at least 3 other clients, and he keeps getting away with it because families don't know how to fight back. Not this time." The meeting ended with a discussion about the Eugene expansion, and we agreed to move forward with a feasibility study and preliminary outreach to potential partners in that area. After everyone dispersed, Jordan lingered in the conference room, helping me clean up the remains of the pastries and coffee cups. "You seem happy," he observed, watching me with the kind of attention that came from years of friendship. I paused, considering the statement. "I am," I said slowly. "I mean, the work is hard and sometimes it breaks my heart, but yes, I'm happy. I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, you know? Like all the terrible things that happened led me to exactly where I need to be." Jordan smiled. "That's called purpose, Rachel. And it looks good on you." That afternoon, I had a meeting scheduled with a potential client, a woman named Patricia Nguyen whose father had recently passed away, leaving behind a will that Patricia suspected had been altered by her stepmother. Patricia arrived at the office precisely on time. A slim woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen enough sleep in weeks. She sat across from me in the consultation room, clutching a folder of documents so tightly her knuckles were white. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to turn. I leaned forward, keeping my voice gentle and my demeanor calm. "You're in the right place. Why don't you start by telling me what happened?" Patricia took a shaky breath and began. Her father had remarried 5 years ago after her mother's death, and the new wife, Linda, had seemed pleasant enough at first. But as her father's health declined, Linda had become increasingly controlling, limiting Patricia's access to him, and making decisions without consulting the family. When her father died 2 months ago, the will reading revealed that everything had been left to Linda, with nothing for Patricia or her brother except a few pieces of furniture. "That doesn't sound like my father," Patricia said, tears welling in her eyes. "He always told us the house would be ours, that he wanted to make sure we were taken care of. But according to this will, he changed his mind completely just 6 months before he died, right when he was at his sickest. I know Linda did something. I just can't prove it." I reviewed the documents she had brought, noting the date of the will, the names of the witnesses, and the language used. It was familiar territory, the same patterns I had seen in my own case and in dozens of others since. "Do you have any earlier wills or estate documents?" I asked. "Anything that would show what your father's original intentions were?" Patricia shook her head. Linda claimed she threw everything out after the new will was created. She said there was no point keeping old documents. "But I know my father kept meticulous records. He wouldn't have just discarded everything." I made notes as she spoke, already forming a mental checklist of what we would need to investigate. "We'll need to request medical records to establish your father's mental capacity at the time the will was signed. We'll want to interview the witnesses who supposedly saw him sign it. And we'll need a forensic document examiner to analyze the signature and determine if it's genuine. All of that takes time and resources, but if your father was coerced or if the will is fraudulent, we can fight it." Patricia's expression shifted from despair to something like hope. "How much will this cost? I've been calling lawyers for weeks and everyone wants thousands of dollars up front. I can't afford that." "This is exactly why we started the foundation," I said. "We work on a sliding scale based on your ability to pay, and in cases where families genuinely can't afford representation, we take them on pro bono. Our goal isn't to make money, it's to make sure families like yours get justice." Patricia started to cry then, not the quiet tears she had been holding back, but deep, shaking sobs of relief. "Thank you," she managed to say between breaths. "Thank you so much." After she left, I sat in the consultation room for a while, feeling the weight of her story settle over me. Every case was different in its details, but the core was always the same. Someone vulnerable had been exploited. A family had been torn apart by greed. And the legal system, which should have protected them, had instead become another obstacle. That was what the foundation existed to change. And every time someone like Patricia walked through our doors, I was reminded of why I couldn't stop, why I wouldn't stop, no matter how exhausting the work became. That evening, I drove out to Pine Ridge Memory Care Facility, something I did once a month to check in with Carolyn and the other staff members who had helped me during my mother's time there. Carolyn had become a friend over the years, someone who understood the unique grief that came from watching a loved one fade slowly, while trying to protect them from predators who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity. She met me in the lobby with a warm hug, and led me to the staff break room where we could talk privately. "How's the foundation doing?" she asked, pouring us both cups of terrible break room coffee that we drank anyway out of habit. "Growing faster than we can keep up with," I admitted. "We're looking at opening a second location, which is exciting but also terrifying. Every time I think we've reached a sustainable pace, 10 more families call needing help." Carolyn nodded knowingly. "That's because you're filling a need that nobody else is addressing. Most families have no idea how to navigate elder abuse situations. They're scared, overwhelmed, and they don't know who to trust. You're giving them a lifeline." We talked for a while about specific cases, about systemic issues we were seeing, about the need for better training for care facility staff to recognize and report financial exploitation. Carolyn mentioned that she had been thinking about developing a training program specifically for memory care facilities, something that would teach staff how to identify warning signs and intervene appropriately. "I love that idea," I said immediately. "Would you be interested in partnering with the foundation on it? We could help with the curriculum development and provide legal context." Carolyn's eyes lit up. "I would love that. Let me put together a proposal, and we can meet to discuss it." Driving home that night, I felt the familiar sense of momentum that came from seeing how one effort sparked another, how the work we were doing was creating ripples that extended far beyond individual cases. The training program Carolyn was proposing could protect hundreds or thousands of vulnerable people. It could change the culture in care facilities, making exploitation harder and detection easier. That was the kind of systemic change that had the power to transform the landscape of elder care. And it had started with a conversation in a break room over bad coffee. When I got home, I found a package waiting on the porch. It was a small box wrapped in brown paper with my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a framed photograph of my parents, one I didn't recognize. They were young in the picture, probably in their 30s, standing in front of the house with their arms around each other. My mother was laughing at something off camera, and my father was looking at her with an expression of such pure adoration that it made my chest ache. Tucked into the frame was a note. "Rachel, I found this while going through some old boxes. I thought you should have it. Your parents loved each other deeply, and they loved you and David just as much. I'm sorry for everything that happened, but I'm grateful you found a way to honor their memory." The note wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting. David. I stared at the photograph for a long time, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Sadness for what had been lost, anger for what he had done, but also a strange gratitude for this gesture. He was trying, in his own broken way, to make amends. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't mean I had forgiven him, but it was something. I carried the photograph inside and found a place for it on the mantel, next to the other family photos I had restored to their rightful places. My parents smiled out from the frame, frozen in a moment of happiness that predated all the pain that would come later. Looking at them, I made a silent promise. I would continue to fight for families like ours. I would continue to build the foundation into something that could protect the vulnerable and hold the exploiters accountable. And I would honor their memory not just by preserving their house or telling their story, but by living a life that reflected the values they had tried to instill in me. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. We launched the feasibility study for the Eugene expansion, hired 2 new case managers to help with the growing caseload, and began working with Carolyn on the care facility training program. Patricia Nguyen's case moved forward, and Elena's forensic analysis revealed significant discrepancies in the will's signature that suggested forgery. We filed a motion to set aside the will, and scheduled a preliminary hearing. The Williamson case went to trial, and Rebecca's presentation of the evidence was so thorough and compelling that the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding in our favor. Each victory felt personal, a validation of everything we were trying to accomplish. But there were also setbacks. A case we had been working on for months fell apart when a key witness recanted their testimony, and we had to accept that the family would not get the justice they deserved. Another client decided to drop their case because the emotional toll of fighting their sibling was too much to bear. These losses weighed on me, reminding me that the legal system, for all its power, was imperfect and that sometimes the best outcome wasn't possible. But the work continued, and so did we. The Foundation's 3rd anniversary gala had been a success, raising enough money to fund operations for another year, and bringing in new volunteers and supporters. I had given a speech that night about transformation, about turning pain into purpose, and the response had been overwhelming. People approached me afterward with their own stories, their own experiences of betrayal and resilience, and I realized that what we were building was bigger than any individual case. We were creating a community of people who refused to accept that exploitation and abuse were inevitable parts of aging, who believed that dignity and justice were rights worth fighting for. One Saturday morning, I woke to find the garden covered in a light frost, the first sign that autumn was giving way to winter. I bundled up in my mother's old cardigan and went outside with a mug of tea, walking among the dormant plants and thinking about the cycles of growth and rest that governed everything. The Foundation, like the garden, needed seasons. Times of intense activity and expansion, but also times of consolidation and reflection. We had been in a growth phase for so long that I hadn't stopped to consider whether we were building sustainably or just racing forward without a solid foundation beneath us. I made a decision then to slow down, to focus on strengthening what we had already built before pushing for more expansion. We would complete the Eugene feasibility study and move forward if it made sense, but we wouldn't rush. We would invest in our existing staff, provide better training and support, and make sure everyone felt valued and equipped to do this difficult work. And I would take time for myself, time to tend the garden and read books that had nothing to do with elder law and remember that I was a whole person, not just the director of a foundation. That afternoon, Jordan came over and we spent hours working in the garden together, cutting back the dead growth, covering the sensitive plants, and preparing everything for winter. We didn't talk much, just worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from deep friendship and shared purpose. When we finished, we sat on the porch with hot cider and watched the sun set over the neighborhood. "This is nice," Jordan said. "We should do this more often. Just be, without always planning or strategizing or problem solving." I agreed. Sometimes I forget that there's more to life than the work. As important as it is, it can't be everything. Jordan looked at me with that knowing expression. "Your mom would want you to be happy, Rachel. Not just fulfilled by your work, but happy in the full sense. Relationships, hobbies, rest. All of it." "I know," I said softly. "I'm working on it." That winter, I did work on it. I started taking pottery classes at a community center, drawn to the meditative quality of working with clay. I reconnected with old friends from my EMT days, people I had lost touch with during the years of fighting David and building the foundation. I went on a few dates, nothing serious, but it felt good to open that part of my life again after so long. And I spent more time in the house, really living in it rather than just sleeping there between long days at the office. The foundation continued its work, but at a more measured pace. We opened the Eugene satellite office in the spring, staffed by local attorneys and case managers who brought their own expertise and passion to the mission. Patricia Nguyen's case concluded with a settlement that restored a significant portion of her father's estate and exposed Linda's fraudulent actions. The Williamson family held a small celebration at our office when their case was finally resolved, and seeing them together, reunited with what had been stolen from them, reminded me why every difficult moment was worth it. On a warm evening in May, almost exactly 4 years after the day I walked into Thomas Whitmore's office and learned I had been written out of my parents' will, I stood in the garden of the Selwood house and planted a new rose bush. It was a variety I had never grown before, one with blooms that shifted from deep purple to soft lavender depending on the light. I dug the hole carefully, amended the soil the way my mother had taught me, and settled the plant into its new home. As I patted the earth around the roots, I thought about how far I had come, how much I had grown, how thoroughly my life had been transformed. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything had instead become the beginning of something I never could have imagined. I had built a foundation that was changing lives, had found purpose that gave meaning to every day, and had learned that resilience wasn't about never falling down but about choosing to get back up, to keep fighting, to transform pain into something that could help others heal. My parents would have been proud of that. I was proud of that. And as the sun set over the garden, casting everything in golden light, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as families needed someone to stand with them against those who would exploit their vulnerability. But tonight, I let myself simply be present in this moment, in this garden, in this house that had been saved and restored and filled with purpose. Tonight, I honored my parents by living fully, by choosing joy alongside justice, by remembering that the best way to fight darkness was not just to expose it, but to create light. And that light, I knew, would continue to grow and spread, touching lives I would never meet, creating ripples that would extend far beyond anything I could see or measure. That was the true legacy, the one worth more than any inheritance. And it was mine to carry forward, one day at a time, one family at a time, one moment of courage and compassion at a time. The journey that had begun with loss and betrayal had led me here, to a life rich with meaning and purpose, to work that mattered and relationships that sustained me. And standing in my mother's garden, surrounded by the beauty she had created and I had preserved, I understood finally that this was what it meant to honor those we love. Not by holding on to the past, but by carrying their values forward into the future, by becoming the kind of person they always believed we could be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.